Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 64. This is a focused subject on the Taino people, and as with any of these spiritual studies focused subjects on a peoples, there is always a need for a historical background that eventually moves into a cultural and spiritual discussion. When it comes to the Taino people, this is a peoples that inhabited what we now call Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, being the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, prior to the intervention of Western powers, most notably the Spanish. The indigenous peoples to these islands beforehand, and in which case the relationship as well with their neighbors, the Carib people, which would ultimately substantiate the name Caribbean. The Taino and the Carib were not in good relations with each other prior to the intervention in the 15th century. The Carib people were living in the Lesser Antilles to the east of them. Now, when it comes to the Taino practices, they were a slash and burn culture, as was the natural way. They had staple foods of the cassava, of yams. They would grow maize, corn, beans, peanuts, peppers, squash. They would grow tobacco. There was a wildcraft of numerous herbs for different ritual or edible purposes. There was hunting of game, most notably small animals, rodents, lizards, birds, fish, and shellfish were important. Parrots were to be used as decoys in hunting, and dogs were domesticated. That will become relevant later. So, when it came to how these peoples would live, you would not see a gathering any larger than 3,000 people. Now, the overall relation between these different gatherings, of course, was language as it relates back into the greater language family of South America. These groups would be ruled by a chieftain. And when I say ruled, that might not be the best word because of that kind of authoritative, you know, aspect that one might assume it to be. Houses were built of logs and poles, thatched roofs. Men wore loincloths, women wore aprons. Both sexes would paint themselves for ceremonial occasions. They would wear earrings of gold and of other crafts, sometimes of necklaces as well, of similar materials. And there was a notable implementation of pottery, which of course will also become relevant later, stone and woodworking, as to be more or less expected. The religion is of an elaborate spiritual ensemble of Zemis, which are spirits and or gods, depending on how you wish to define. These spirits would take on the form of different idols that they would carve out of bone and stone and wood and cotton. This elaborate system also had its fair share of different ceremonies and taboos. These taboos and ceremonies would be known by all because the religion and spirituality was involved in all aspects of the day-to-day life. So by the time these peoples were met with the Spanish in 1492, Columbus came to meet or became aware of 5 different Taino chieftains in Hispaniola. Again, this island that is what we now call the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and to whom had to pay tribute to the local chieftains. Now, when it came to what they called the island, they called it Aiti, which means the land of high mountains. This derives into what we now call Haiti as it moved through Creole. Haiti to Haiti. The largest island of them, right, of the Taino people would have been Cuba, and this was divided into 29 different chiefdoms. All the names that substantiate are derivative from Taino language: Havana, Baracoa, Bayamo, and onward. The names survive to this day, much as you see as city names in the States with native names. The one that comes to mind is Minnesota, the land of waters. And then, they took that with Greek and they made Minneapolis, mini meaning water, Apolis for the Greek city. So this same sort of trope here in the Caribbean. Now, when it came to the idea of what Cuba means, it could be Cuboa or Cubeo, which is where fertile land is abundant, or Cobana, which is a great place. Puerto Rico was also, as they all were, divided into chieftains, and of course to deal with them or to be in the vicinity, tributes would have to be paid. Different Taino relationships were based off of different tributes that would be paid to different chieftains. The largest population, again, ever recorded would have been just around over 3,000 people. You can think of this, too, as an interesting digression into quality of life. Perhaps there is something to say about when a population of humans grows too large, that a certain dissonance can start to begin, a certain numerification of individuals can start to begin. So, the idea of creating cities in the ancient world, or vast concentrated human population in small areas, would have been something to not do intentfully, which would pay a very interesting contrast to the modern day world, of course. So, this hostility with the Carib people, of course, was one that you might expect of the old world. Raids would take place. Women would be taken captive, enslaved, and subsequently you would see that Taino would be spoken within these Carib populations because of this taking of peoples from the Taino tribes. So, as of 1550, the Taino people were nearing extinction by the intervention of Spanish colonialism. However, as the nuance of this story continues, you see that the mixture of Spaniards and Africans and other peoples with the Taino, I guess bloodline is one way to put it, ultimately substantiates its diaspora into the modern day. So a fair amount of those that inhabit this area, Puerto Rico, Cuba, these greater Caribbean islands, and of course the southeast in the United States, most notably Florida, have this traced ancestral history to these people, a triracial ancestry at times. So this subsequently brings the retention and the curiosity of this history and of this people into the modern day, although the kind of like full populace of the people was horribly detrimented. Whew. So while the name gets thrown around, since it was thought of as extinct, then scholarship has overall become lacking on the subject, leading to independent scholars to take up most of the reins when it comes to reconstructing the knowledge that we have of these peoples. And also a certain not derivation, well, yeah, maybe derivation of, if you take, say, native Haitian voodoo beliefs, if you take some of the Catholicism out of that, and if you take and trace some of the African influenced tribal beliefs from that, then what's left could be intuited as what had been inherited from the Taino spirituality. However, less subtly speaking, the American language, or English language, which American is a horrible word for that, but the greater plethora of the English language has taken in a fair amount of loan terms from the native language of the Taino people, most notably the hammock, the canoe, the word hurricane, of course the many names of places in the Caribbean, Cuba, as mentioned before, the word tobacco, barbecue, even. And it should very much be noted that the natives welcomed the Spaniards when they arrived. And so this hostility that was brought to them is, of course, what is ultimately characteristic by the Western world alone in its colonial efforts during this time. The word Taino, or Taina, means good or noble in the local language. So in that case, we are again using their language to name themselves, and of which is not always the case with indigenous peoples in the English language. So where'd they come from, and what is this spirituality that we're moving towards to talk about? So the Taino people were, by certain studies, traced to be originated in Venezuela, which is, of course, a tenuous subject, because originated, what does that really mean? There is a migration that was tracked from the Yucatan in Mexico roughly around 5000 BC into the islands. There is also a claim about them being descendants from around 300 BC, migrating from the Orinoco River Valley in South America. All of these are just as tenuous as any of these claims that we followed throughout the course, including when we did so with the Yoruba, or say when we did so with the Siberian tribes, or even when we did so with the Polynesians. Scholarly evidence and stitching back of these stories is always very tenuous. So the archaeological investigations has substantiated a lot of what we get to talk about today, most notably the unveiling of several caves, which were an absolute boon of religious iconography, petroglyphs, pictographs, rock art, carvings, of which the Cemis that we'll be talking about later, or actually very shortly. As mentioned, this religious reverence was a part of everyday affairs. This art, this medicine, this religion was all in the same bag. The living life was the spiritual life. And these customs were believed to have come from their ancestors, such is the way of the native Chinese beliefs initially, right, before Buddhism, such is the way of the Polynesian beliefs in certain instances and certain leanings of the mind, and most notably, such is the way of the natives of America, believing that their customs and their spiritualities were given to them by their ancestors, which is a whole subject to get into. These idols, these small carvings that I mentioned before, Cemis, Cemis, were these conduits for, or embodiments of, or eyes for, in this world, spirits that they had come to know. So to give these spirits a kind of foothold in this world would be to create this small idol, this Cemi. Again, stone, bone, cloth, cotton, to construct a body for, and they would carry it around religiously, let's just put it that way. They would carry it around all the time. So when the Spaniards observed this, they thought of it as an analogy for the cross, right? Because Christians would carry the cross everywhere around with them. So they thought of it as similar. They would pray over these idols, right? These Cemis. They would pray. They would bury them along with people. They would bury them in the ground to induce fertility for their crops. These figurines. And so when it came to what that particular figurine, that Semi, would represent, that was always individualistic, right? Chieftains, and shamans were said to have held the most significant Semis. So in which case, the individual's own power to imbibe this figurine with this supernatural essence. And we can see how, again, when talking before about how discerning the Taino beliefs is ultimately from taking out from voodoo what is other than, the Taino beliefs, you can see how this spirituality ultimately lends itself to how people recognize voodoo, which of course is its own spiritual study session, but you can even superficially see what's happening here. So again, these figurines as mediums between what anthropologists would call like the noumena, the numinous forces of the culture, the spirit world, this means. So if you could kind of charge something with a certain vibe that you'd wish to instill into the world, again, to the spirit that they believed created fertility in the crops that would grow, say, the cassava, they would imbibe the figurine with this spirit, this growth, this fertility of the cassava, and put that in the ground as an intentionality, as a wish, as a prayer, and as a show of respect and acknowledgement to this beingness. So when it came to cultivating or creating the figure, say that one is traveling through the woods and feels intuitively that this tree wishes to give itself over as give its form to host whatever spirit, right? So you take note of this tree as it speaks to you in this intuitive way, and you go to the shaman, Behiki. You go to the Behiki, the shaman, and bring the shaman back and have the shaman speak with the tree or the stone or whatever you're wishing to cultivate into a Semi. And the Behiki would question this tree, just in our example. And if it was in accordance with this intuitive way, with this non-taboo infringing way, or without infringing on taboo, without infringing on disrespecting of the autonomous entity of that tree, that it wished to give itself to this through the conduit and verification of the shaman, then it would be done. It would be given permission, so to speak. And the ceremony of making it so would be performed to the dot and correctly, carved into and imbibed with that particular wished spirit. Now, also, there is this practice of sacred medicines, the Cahoba ritual, of which is attemptively trying to be replicated into the modern day. Now, what would this be? What would this look like? Well, effectively, you had this familiar thing, which is the vomiting stick, and it's only familiar if you're familiar with the Aztec and the Mayan rituals. So one would induce vomiting by this stick in order to purify the body, in order to take in the sacred medicine. This served a few different functions. Of course, there's the physiological functions, but then there is the showing of the effort to honor the Cahoba spirit of which you are inviting in. You would clear all the room and show the effort, the purging, as this act of solidarity to invite in properly, host the Cahoba. And so this powder was ground up and would be snorted by a kind of wide tube. And when I say wide, I don't mean like I mean like the letter Y. Two nostrils, one down. You get what I'm saying. And of course, this powder would be intermixed with seeds of a tree, the anadenanthera, tree seeds, and of which case we see this plenty with sacred medicines in the ancient world, how it's an intermixture of different plant parts, plant substantiated as a cocktail of some sort, which pharmacologically speaking is highly nuanced and almost miraculous that it would seem to be have known how these particular substances play together. Well, how do they know about this? They were told by the spirit. This influence of the plant medicine would facilitate otherworldly investigation, of course, intermingling with the Cemis, and would assist in things like prophecy and decision making for tribal decisions. Also, with aspects of weather. The uncertainty of the ancient world in facilitating agriculture, and also in facilitating safety of the people from such things, in particular with this culture of preventing one's harm from a hurricane, which are frequent, at least frequent, relatively speaking. So these greater gods, these greater spirits, the Zemi, Zemi. So these spirits, these functions of the universe are thought of as such, right? Functions of the universe, functions of everyday things. I've made the analogy several times throughout the course. The sun does something in the world. This spirit represents what the sun does. The plants grow out of the field. This spirit represents what that growing of something out of a field, the functions of the universe as they are immediately observable. However, they did not personify, as the Western paganisms would, these gods per se, like say with the Greeks or say with the Nordic people. They gave personalities to the functions of these things, that they would almost seem human in certain ways. I mean, especially with the Celtic people, their gods seem very humanized, whereas the Zemi, again, are more functional as a concept of a god or spirit. And so the ways of honoring this, right? There is the show of obedience, or the show of honor. Honor is the much better word, in different rituals to the Zemi and what they do, which effectively helps the people, right? To all the food that you have, to the fresh air that you breathe, to the animals that come to you for the hunt, to the good things that you can make out of all of these things. All of these things are gifted by the functions of the universe, yes? So these rituals to show solidarity, respect, and gratitude for these things. Of course, as we might expect, there is the medicine man running and hosting these rituals, the healings that come, of course, as other ceremonies, the dancing and the music that would be a part of these public ceremonies, of course, because the way to facilitate the spirit would be to sing and dance. And such is not unique, and such is across the world. And of course, there is always the regalia, and the regalia of the special dress of the painting and the feathered bodies. Their knees, from their knees down, would be covered in shells, which I would think would be a sort of grounding homage. The shaman would present the carved, the figurine, his own or their own Zemi figurine, which would kind of be a a very, again, as previously mentioned, a very powerful aspect to these ceremonies. And of course, the chieftain would sit in the place of honor, which would be like a stool or a throne of certain sorts, observing the ceremony and the beating of drums. And in which case you would also see the Zemi, the particular hosted spirit, sitting and observing as the chieftain sits and observes. Then there is, again, involving in this ritual very often is the swallowing of the stick, which is the vomiting, and then there is the taking in of potential sacred medicines, as it would also be a part of these ceremonies. Purging, sacred medicine, offering anything that is brought for food after the ceremony is done first to the Zemi, to the figurine. This is still observed across the world. Most notably, you could see it with the Native American Anipe in the sweat lodges. Before anyone, after they have fasted all day and done the sweat, before anybody takes of the food, the figure that represents the spirit in the ceremony always receives it first. This is a trope of ancient traditions across the world, again. And this often would be, the food presented would be a bread, a cassava bread, which women would serve, again, first to the Zemi and then to the people. This sacred bread as a protector, right? And in which case you can see that there are analogies to the Eucharist. And this is also to say that what has bread represented into the ancient past well beyond what was appropriated by Christianity. And then once all of this is over, once all of the ceremony has been done, then you invite in the poet, and the poet comes with the maraca. The maraca is a quintessential sacred artifact of these people, and we will talk more about that later. The poet comes with the maraca and tells of the stories, the oral histories, the traditions, and recites it well into the rest of the night. And this is the ceremony. That is the cap of the ceremony. So when it comes to a brief mention of the afterlife, there is this concept of the good being rewarded and meeting up with those that have died before you, those that you know, friends and relatives, and of course, subsequently, the ancestors, which are well beyond you, of course. But when it comes to this afterlife of those being rewarded, it was most often observed that this was for women, of all things. It's curious because women were thought of to be more of the bearers of good. So most often those that would be rewarded in the afterlife. Now, there's certain sociological things to observe here, right? This kind of idea of women doing no wrong. And I believe that this is more of a wholesome homage that goes back to this more mother goddess concept, the creation of women having its own kind of story behind it versus the creation of man. But we'll see in a bit how their goddess was supreme. So this is a culture that holds the matriarchal, the creating mother above all, really. So, although the chieftain is male, this is still true. So this is a very nuanced observation. Of course, we can never separate cultural understandings from spirituality. Okay. So, these Zemi, as they are presented in their figurines or into the rock art or into the cave drawings, can take on many forms, some more seemingly disturbing than others, right? Very grotesque human faces, distorted faces, but of course the forms of different animals. You can see turtles, snakes, alligators and toads. Frogs and toads play a particularly strong role in the embodiment of different zemi throughout this tradition, which I think is again a curious analogy that relates it back to China and to traditions of Shintoism in Japan. The use of the frog as an actual trope in religion, because you don't see that in the Western world. Anyway, this aspect too of relating the Taino to other cultures is actually has a lot more of a boon to it than one might expect. We will see this when we're talking now about these different myths. And so this first one that we can talk about is the banishment of Yael. So I'm going to go over a few myths here, and I'm going to paraphrase and give some level of deconstruction to what we come up with. So this first one. In the beginning, there was a man called Yaya, meaning spirit of spirits, and no one knew his name. Yaya is just a kind of loan word, which means supreme being, so nobody knows the true name of the supreme being. His son was called Yayael, which means the son of Yaya, plainly. Yaya was banished for wanting to kill his own father. After being banished for 4 months, curious number, his father killed him instead and put his bones in a gourd, very important, and hung it from the roof of the house. Some time passed, and one day Yaya said to his wife, "I want to see our son." This made her happy, and she seemed to misinterpret the meaning. She took down the gourd, she touched it, and turned it over to see the bones. However, once it was opened, it flooded out fish, big and small. All of its bones, all of Yayao's bones turned into fish. And then they decided to eat them. So this seems obscure, right? And there's always more to unpack when it comes to these ancient stories. So there are many different allegories, which is the language of the ancient spiritual world. There are many different allegories to try to discern from this. And I am not going to pretend that any of these are conclusive, that any of these are the truth with a capital T. I am just attempting to do what I can. So this taking of the gourd, or the touching of the gourd, is an alteration of its own purpose. The gourd is a container, right? So as it is, it stores something. However, to open it would change its function, and so thus the relating of changing its contents. I know that's rather on the surface. So if, as an example, the maraca is a gourd that is full of seeds. There's a lot of palpable allegory there. And as soon as it's opened, it's not a maraca anymore. Now they're just seeds. There is a power in the unknown. There is a power in what is concealed. And to try to put the energy of consciousness onto it, or to try to put sight to it, demeans, changes, and solidifies ultimately that which is concealed. So there's something big here. So this maraca, right, you can, and I said I would mention it before, the idea of this maraca, this concealment of seeds within the gourd, you can also see how the gourd is analogous to the sacredness of a woman. You know, the act of giving birth is the seed and the womb, right? And so you see the maraca as this representation, not only like, so the seed and the gourd seems to facilitate, invite spirit, which would become a person in the body of a woman, right? So the seeds in the gourd is an invitation of spirit, symbolically, allegorically, however you wish to understand it. This desire to see Yael could have been a reference to a ceremony of which would conjure the spirit, right? The likeness, much in the same way as into a semi or a figurine. The misunderstanding of trying to do this literally could have been a part of this story told, where the wife, the woman, is happy to want to literally see the son again. And this is where it goes wrong. Now, this idea of eating the fish that had been spilled out has been interpreted by different scholars as a representation of self-destruction. And that's certainly one interpretation, the temptation to eat the fish. There's also, the temptation to take what is given or what is provided of the situation, no matter what. I mean, we are given these things of living in this life to eat so that we may live. The reiteration of cycle that is life itself. The things that live become dead things that become fed on to substantiate other things that will live, that will subsequently later be fed on. Anyway, I don't know. There's a lot. I'm spinning here. Anyway. There's the surrendering of the temptation, and to take part in that which was given by the body of their son, which is a trope of ancient proportions of which I don't care to get into right now. But of course, the big one was right at the beginning of the story, the analogy to the Judeo-Christian mythology, the cosmogony of them not knowing the God's real name, the creator God's real name, and just saying things like the supreme being. The old quote, "I am who I am," to belong only to oneself. This as an analogy, and also the son trying to betray the father, which could be somewhat like almost shiftily an analogy to Satanos, the antagonist, right? So, that kind of synchronicity. There are those that argue that monotheism was the beginning of all religions. I think that's overly reductionist. But it is to say that in these ancient mythologies, you do often see tropes that would ultimately bleed down into what is considered monotheism, or in this case, Judeo-Christianity. Anyway. Another myth for you. So, it is said one day, when Yahya had gone away to his lands of inheritance, which is an interesting reference, right? Where the lands that he inherited, the supreme being inherited. Very curious. 4 sons came forth from one woman. This woman is known as the Bleeding Ancient One. All 4 of these children, these 4 sons, came from one womb, and all were twins. Now this is very important, because the use of twins as a cosmological trope is vast across the world. There is the white god and the black god of the Slavic pantheism. There is, of course, the very reoccurrent use of twins in the cosmogonies of the Dogon in Africa. So that's just a curious thing to go down. Anyway, all came from one womb and all were twins. 4 quadruplets, identical quadruplets. After dying in childbirth, the woman was cut open. And, this might lend to the name, the Bleeding Ancient One. And the 4 children were taken out, which is also a kind of a C-section reference. Now, all of these children don't have names, with exception to one. This one is called Demenon, which is the scabby one. So there's a distinction to this one, right? Versus the other ones have no distinction and thus no name. And while they were eating, they sensed that Yaya was returning from those mysterious lands. And in haste, they moved to hang up the gourd, which I'm supposing is a sort of cultural nod. But they didn't make sure that it was hanging up properly. And it fell. And then it broke open in half. And out of the gourd spilled a horrifying amount of water that covered the whole earth and came with all these fish. You see some similarities here. And this is not only the Great Flood, right? But this is potentially, as another interpretation, the same interpretation, the sea's origin. And in this myth, the sea and all of its fish were birthed out of this gourd. So maybe, and it's definitely a stretch, but there is this reoccurrent use of this term in the course, panspermismos, which is a spiritual term at times, but then there is the historical term, which was to say that everything that we enjoy on this earth, including its own water, was brought by the heavens. And that is to say, an asteroid brought it, right? Cracked open and spilled it all out. Because there is a substantial question, how did water get here to begin with? And that is one answer. And so this myth could be an interesting nod to that panspermismos model, that extraterrestrial element. And when I say extraterrestrial, I mean literally an asteroid. I'm not talking about anything else. Anyway, so this gourd that had been broken in two, notice the form. What is the form of a gourd that had been broken in two? Well, these now look like canoes. And in which case they used these canoes from the gourd to travel across the sea. And the four brothers learn on their trip the new cultural norms that will become society. So, in this case too, what does the gourd represent? Right? Something always happens, something severe always happens when the gourd is touched. So in that way, it could represent the sacred in a certain sense. You leave the sacred things alone for good reason. The consequences of touching that which is sacred are severe. So there's that. And these are two lessons that we see throughout both of these myths mentioned so far. This use of the gourd as a religious and or animistic trope goes well beyond the Taino. It goes to, of course, the tribes of North America. It goes to the tribes of South America, the empires of South America. It goes to India, China, and the Middle East. This is something that could be its own session, which isn't a very readily observed spiritual symbol, right? The snake is always very ubiquitous. The cross, these different sigils are very ubiquitous as they're used across, very recognizably. But the gourd is this undermentioned, reoccurrent trope. And of course, again, when we saw in the like Western world, especially with Egypt, as it kind of came also from Babylon, and as it moved into Greece, the omega, the horned ox, the cow, the omega symbol, or the cauldron of Cerduin with the Celtic people, would represent this same womb space that was utterly sacred. And in this case, instead of that, we have the gourd as a different but same symbol of something significant. There's also another trope here that we can observe, not as abundantly, but very much idiosyncratically with the Taino, and that is caves. And reoccurrently in the stories, things come out of caves. most notably the moon and the sun, came out of caves. There's a story that the people lived in caves and only came out at night. And this seems like an incomplete story, but I'll tell it anyway. One guard was supposed to be watching over the people to make sure that they were well divided across the land. And again, there's that trope again. Well divided across the land. Intentful use of population. Interesting. However, one day he was late to returning to his post, and the sun came out unexpectedly and turned him into a stone pillar. Another person who witnessed this became angry at the sun for doing this, and he decided to leave the cave, to leave this whole thing. And so he tried to gather everybody. He tried to gather all of the women and the children and convince them to leave the men who would insist upon staying. And they did leave. And then the children on their journey were deserted. And they became so hungry that they turned into frogs. See, there it is again, frogs. And the women just completely vanished. And the men were left without all of them. And this is where the story drops off, as far as I could find it. So there's a number of allegories to try to take from even this fragmentary story. The deserting of the cave, the blaming of the sun for its own functions. I mean, there's some good palpable meaning to take from this. I mean, is this also a kind of point away from that existential feeling of being a victim unto the world? That could be one interpretation. Anyway, these myths, as they were passed down, have substantiated other, and of course as they do in these traditions, these myths substantiate cultural taboos and decisions that the cultures make. That previously mentioned scabby one, Debanon, which I hope I'm saying correctly, is the first shaman of the Taino people. And that story, as it's still told today, this myth of the first creator of the Taino shamans, the scabby one. And this story, this particular version of the story as it is beginning with the four divine brothers as they are wandering across the celestial realm. As mentioned before, the one brother that is distinguished is the scabby one, Demenon. One day the brothers snuck into the garden of the Supreme Spirit. So Yaya's garden. This might be the realm of inheritance, which again, the garden as a great cultural, spiritual taboo, or not taboo, but, synchronicity. And the brothers in the garden found a giant, you guessed it, gourd, and were trying to peer into it when the gourd split in half, and the great flood came forth from the gourd and swept the brothers away from the celestial realm to be aimlessly wading across this watery new world. And in this watery new world, they found an old man. And the old man said that he was their grandfather and gave them the cassava bread. And once the old man did so, he spit tobacco on to Debanon. And where the spit landed on his skin, he started to become swollen and sore, and it spread across him. And he became more swollen and more swollen. And so they decided to cut open where he was spit on. And a turtle comes out of the cut. And when he recovers, he realizes now that he is able to communicate with the Zemi, with the spirits, with the god. And this is how Debinon became the first Taino shaman. Now, there's a few things here. The turtle emerging out of this cut might seem very strange. However, if you are familiar with the shaman's works, then that is to say that the use of skinwalking, the use of shape-shifting, as previously mentioned into this course, of embodying oneself with the particular spirit of a particular animal is a absolutely prehistoric trope. And so the turtle coming out of this cut could also be very indicative to show that the spirits are within, this spirit is within, capable of being embodied from the very blood of Debinon, of the first shaman. And this is, of course, both a blessing and a curse. To become the shaman, oftentimes in ancient society, there is the trope of the shaman sickness. The sickness is an indicator that this one is given the gift and the curse of becoming a shaman. To become a shaman in that role is not something done lightly. That's a whole session as to itself. Now, their grandfather, is an interesting implication, if it's true, if that old man really was their grandfather, because they're allegedly born of the bleeding old one. Anyway. This gift of the tobacco spit, which again, the tobacco is already a sacred medicine used ubiquitously across ritual. So the gift from spirit itself, from grandfather, from the ancestors, to receive this gift of communication with the gods on behalf of the peoples. And yet again, we saw also there was another trope of touching the gourd in the garden, which is that not the apple, or more accurately, the fig tree, for those that don't know, in the Garden of Eden? Anyway, in that being a taboo that ultimately incited the world as we know it, that was the watery world that spilled from the gourd. Oh, boy. Anyway, this Zemi, I want to mention some more as well. This invitation of spirits into form, whereas the shaman could invite spirits into their body for use of, say, through sacred medicine or through use for ritual, or into the iconography or the icons, the fetishes, the carved rocks, to imbibe things with meaning. So the Zemi are kind of a double entity, a double meaning, in the sense that there is that which is embodied into something, and then that there is that of which is incorporeal or understood but not embodied so physically, right? So there is the characteristic of that particular spirit as it is embodied, and then as it's unembodied, which also could be an analogy of the splitting of the gourd, where it's all one. There is the incorporeal and the corporeal, which is the whole gourd, but once it is touched and split open, then you have bifurcated the two aspects that ultimately make this thing whole. There's some potential symbolism there. So I want to also mention that with these Zemi, there is an absolute huge host, as it's understood, of the different names and the different spirits of this tradition. However, there is a loose list, of which I'm not going to try to name them all by name. I'm going to give the aspects, because at certain times this language is as challenging as the Mayan gods' names. And I really don't want to offend anybody who knows them better. However, the supreme, as previously mentioned in the course and in this talk, is Atabi. And Atabi is the moon. Atabi is the fresh water. Atabi is the fertility of the earth. Atabi is the supreme nurturing mother, and is also has her kind of antithesis or other side of her face, the Guabanke or the Guabankex, which is the goddess of storms and volcanoes. So you have both the nurturing mother, the sacred mother, and the destructive, angered goddess mother simultaneously, given two different names. And again, this is like, there's so many examples of this across the ancient world. This is Tara, as it is taken in by the Buddhists. This is, the dangerous mother would be like Kali. This is something seen across. And of course, this Guabanke would be that which would ultimately stir up the huracan, or the hurricanes, the violent churnings of storm and rain and hurricane, would be not necessarily pure destructive force of death. It is chaos incarnate upon the earth. Yes, the consciousness of Mother Earth stirring up chaos. However, this was thought of as a transformational happening. This transformational happening was in the interest of life. Ultimately, in a more macrocosmic sense than regular human society tends to think. So this seemingly fury would seem to be, on the surface, a contradiction of Atabi's beneficence. However, there is such a thing as tough love, and there is such a thing as being dynamic, animate, and effective towards a certain aim toward love. Anyway, it is said that Atabi was so powerful that she gives birth to herself as well as the world. And so this is a very, notable figure. I mean, you do see ancient primordial deities, most notably the cow deity of the Nordic was just there at the beginning and gave birth to everything. That is an ancient trope where it's usually just there, or she's usually just there. But this is to say that not only was she just there, she gave birth to herself explicitly, which is an extra step up the power scale, I suppose, and is shown in this, or traditionally shown in this cross-legged birthing position. There is also this unmentioned part that she is the goddess of beauty and subsequently music. So all the beautiful things of the earth, of which come from fertility, and all fertility of, say, like a beautiful person, come from fertility. It all is Atabi, is what I'm trying to point out here. Okay. So, here's another story. Atabi made two sons, Yukaju and Guankar, and set them off to work on making the earth something booming with life. Yukaju was given the heavens. So he took a bunch of these gemstones from the darkest caves to create the sun, the moon, and the stars. So, they all came from somewhere else and were brought here. And next, he and his mother filled the earth with birds and animals and vegetation, creating a cross between the animals and the god. This being that they created between animals and the god was the first man. Yukaju also ruled the sea, and it lived within the deep. He was also believed to live at times in the sky, among the stars, so that he could watch over what was happening, the vantage point from the stars. He and this other god of healing were associated with the cassava root, and thus the sacredness of the cassava, the confluence of two very extraordinary deities. Healing, of course, is a hugely important trope in any religious society. These effigies, these figurines of embodying Yukaju, and then burying him in the field to grow the cassava. That is what I was hoping to mention before. However, Guankar seemed to have been neglected in this story, right? All of that was done by Yukaju. He saw that the mother and his brother were creating all of this and became very jealous. And so he transformed himself into an evil spirit. He became like the hurricane, or the hurricane as we say. He became like Guabanque, or Guampanquex, which is the storm again. And then created two sons, of which were thunder and lightning, to stir up and to mess up the creations. We saw this in the polytheism of Polynesia. One of the brothers is jealous. Or you could take this over to Sumeria. Enlil and Enki. One of the brothers hoping to destroy what the other one made. And thus the storms of the sea. So of course these rampages are what would come to harm mankind's crops. You know, this being that was created, because he was created by his brother, right? So this mankind would pray to the gods to spare him, would pray to Yukaju, to Adabi, to spare him from the detriments. And this is another version of the myth, right? And also why the hurricanes come. So let's list off some other spirits that could be embodied, or other gods within this pantheon, so to say. So there is the son of the gray serpent, the deity that which would announce the fertilizing rain as it would come to the earth. Meteorological. There is also the deity that carries the waters from the mountains. The one that is embodied too by the drifting storm clouds that come down. Then there is also the deity that represents the weather of which there are no clouds. This is a particular deity ruling. That one who announces the sun. Gabriel's horn vibes here. Anyway, there is also the deity of thunder. That one who announces the storm. And the one that announces the rain. You could see how each of these potentially embodied spirits would be effective, right? If a particular means was to be met. There is also the deity of sexual delight, romance, and spontaneity. So that seems quite derivative of Adabi, right? There is the lord of the yucca plant, the bitterness and strength of the yucca plant, which again, this spiritification of a sacred medicine or of a staple food of a culture is hugely important. There is the guardian of the workers, the fire to clear the earth. This is a particular deity, the slash and burn. So to bring the energy of the slash and burn deity in order to facilitate transformation of the land for the interest of the greater story. Then there is the guardian of the plants, the replenisher of life. So once those things are there, to guard them as they have their time on the earth. The guardian of life, including animals, including humans, including everything alive. Now the one that is, there's two here. So there is the Lord of Death, which is also synonymous of the sweetness and the delight, and also is brought in by a certain symbol of bats, which is a curious reference. Now, this Lord of the Dead, also as it is associative of the guardian of the dead, which is the dog god. Now, here we are again, right? You have Cerberus of the Greeks, the guardian of Hades, and we saw this too in Mayan polytheism, and almost so with Anubis in Egypt. This trope of the god, the dog god of guarding the dead. We can find two here with the Taino. Now, I've gone over a lot. And I've pointed out a number of synchronicities. However, I want to cap this with two things. I want to talk about the resurgence of the Taino. And I also want to give summary to a lot of what I've brought up. But first, this previously mentioned limitation of how much can be known about the Taino people. And also this business of ancestry, of feeling like this is a part of myself that calls to me. I don't share this ancestry, but I'm talking that this is arising. You see, there is resurgence. There are efforts towards resurgence when it comes to this tradition. And there's interest that's growing in this tradition. And it's simultaneous with neo-paganisms that are arising in Europe. And I'm not saying this is like taking over, but I'm saying it's happening in a way that hasn't happened. This resurgence is most notably caught up in trying to bring back the shamanic arts, the healing methods of the ancient past and of this area, and also bringing back the specific ceremonies that were indicative to this area and indicative to the Caribbean as it is, right? The stories of the Caribbean as they were, not stories that were imported, but as they were, reviving the medicines that were provided by the land, reviving the use of these medicines and the sacredness of these medicines, which extends to the Cahoba ritual, which I mentioned in the beginning. The sacred medicine of trying to create the cocktail that became the sacred medicine for use in ritualistic circles. This as a means to facilitate visions in order to learn the greater methods to, again, contact spirit once again and to gain the instructions of how to refacilitate, recultivate, and revive this way of existing and bring it back and heal this land, through clairvoyance, through prophetic dreaming, through some sort of miraculous means that comes along with the work, the labor of re-engaging with the spirit, with the ancestors, with the forgotten traditions. So here's an interesting take, is that if something has been eradicated from this earth, if the old way has really been broken, what do the natives say how they got these traditions, right? They say that spirit told them. The ancestors gave it to them, that the grandmother gave it to them. Something delivered the way to them. So is it to say that it's this literal case where it has just been endlessly shared from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear? Well, in this case, no. It's to say that spirit, or this means of direct, you experientially direct communication with spirit, i.e., through sacred medicine ritual, through shamanic ceremony, through trance states, through any of these means, could come to learn, could re-engage with this way that is given through spirit, or what you might call intuition, or natural organic way of approaching life. It's an open ear, open bodied, open eyed way to hearing from the subtleties all around you of something greater than you, to be as a guide, and to each land its own voice. And so this effort of reviving the ancient Taino rituals is also an effort of this, as mentioned before in the course, this religion loci, and in which case it's to say we don't want any of this Christianity. This Christianity came on boats from places and is about places that we have nothing to do with. Have we ever been to the rivers of Jordan? Have we ever had anything to do with Jerusalem? Have we anything to say about Israel? No, we exist here. Right? We exist by this river. We exist in these mountains. We exist on this land. And we are comprised literally of this land. The food as it cultivates, as it feeds us, as it becomes our bodies, we are this land. So we talk and are spiritually nourished by this land, by this ensemble of spirit and creation and fertility and the particular nuance of the weather, right? This re-embracing of finding sacredness here, in the observable functions of the universe as it is here, and experiential. So, in summarization, I hope this hasn't come across as too meandering. The Taino have interesting ties and tropes to beliefs as they've carried all across the world. The trope of the brothers battling over creation, of one being jealous of the relationship with the mother, the supreme mother goddess as another trope, as it was found and as it was uniquely retained through the ancient world. And of course the Spanish came and took it and ruined it. God. Anyway, the trope of the gourd. The very fascinating take on what the maraca actually is and the symbology of that maraca. The fascinating take of the double-sidedness, in a certain misunderstanding of the sense, of Guambankex and of Adabi, of the nurturing mother goddess and the fury of the mother goddess. This is very powerful, this is very palpable, and this is very much, relatable to traditions well across the world. Now, this use of sigils, or I shouldn't say sigils, I should say the figurines, the Cemis, as a conduit for meaning and as for spirit. I mean, this is something that is also likely going to be a thread followed later into the course, in the sense that what our particular ability as human beings to imbibe anything with significance and meaning, and such is the absolute crux of spiritual signification in this world. I mean, why is anything worth of value versus this other thing that's not worth of value, right? It's completely what we ascribe to it, right? So theoretically, or I should say experientially, we can do this with anything. I mean, I like to use the dollar bill as an instance. It's an utterly useless thing. I mean, you could use it as a little bit of a kindling for a fire starter, but its power is completely derived by the imbibement of meaning into it, mutually agreed upon, you see, right? So What if we created these figurines and genuinely pushed signification into it metaphysically by our own faculties, right? What sort of reality would that look like, right? And how does this implication ultimately turn or become how people recognize voodoo is something for a later session. The stories of the first shamans, as we find in this tradition too, the story of the first shaman is very significant. When we saw it in Siberia, it was, I think it was the Cat people that had a story of the first shaman being an eagle, that they inherited the wisdom from the eagle, and that being the guardian of the heavens. The eagle flies the most high, and such is the understanding of what the shaman does under sacred states, is that they astral project, their body goes up into the sky to look over, right? Or to commune with the voices of the wind, to commune with that which is above. I don't need to necessarily reiterate all the strongest points here. It's been a long time since I've done a focus session. I'm very happy that this was one to get into. You know, something just as small as saying the word barbecue, right? Something just as small as saying, hey, I got a new hammock. I mean, these things are a nod to these people and all the power in the world to those working to bring this signification, bring these ceremonies, to bring this way back, right? To bring it back to where it was from. My heart fully in for all of that. Anyway, I'll leave for now.